Thank you so much for having me a part of the the science speaker series. I'm sorry, I am a little bit of upper respiratory stuff going on here, so you may hear me coughing and getting myself together. But I'm still here in great spirits, and I'm thoroughly enjoying this series, and I'm very honored to be invited to speak with you today. And so I'll give you a little bit of background about myself, and then I'll also jump into the presentation that I've titled "Environmental Justice and Learning Your Context." And the reality is, no matter where we go, there's going to be an environment that we need to learn more about, right? We're going to need to learn about the people, we're going to need to learn about the spaces, and we're going to have to think about the different ways in which the environment is connected to the people. Again, my name is Monica Miles. I am the Chief Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Officer and also the Chief of Research with the Physician Assistant Education Association. And in this role, I help the PA or Physician Assistant programs in the United States. So that's over about 280 campuses and their programs. And I think about diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to supporting educational programming. I have an environmental background, and also my bachelor's and master's are in science and geology, and my doctoral work was in science education, where I focus on equity. And my postdoc work, I looked across various STEM spaces, and I looked at the trajectory of, thinking about what does marginalization look like in K-12, and then how does it appear or reify in higher education spaces. Today, my work more looks at environmental justice and how we think about the connection between spaces that people occupy and the people that we're focusing on, thinking about marginalized people. And so you have the link here. I encourage you to do this on your own. Well, we don't have this live today, but if we were in person, we would be having you put that in the chat. But basically, doing a land acknowledgement, right, and reminding ourselves we are on Indigenous land. I am on the land of the Haudenosaunee, and just the Tuscarora Reservation is maybe about 15 minutes from my house, a 15-minute drive from my house, right here on we're the Niagara River Basin. So I'm in the Great Lakes region. I'm in Buffalo, New York, and so a lot of the examples I talk about are related to Buffalo, New York, right? And learning my context and knowing my context, right? And so the Tuscaroras, even though they're sitting and they're literally on the edge looking at the Niagara River, they do not have access to clean drinking water on the reservation, right? And how that is a contemporary environmental justice issue, right? And even thinking about where the power authority sits, right? Robert Moses had so many other options of land he could have built on. Instead, they went after the land of the Tuscaroras, right? And how that was an environmental justice issue, right? And how the Tuscaroras were not passive, right? They did disrupt the building of the reservoirs and things, right? But they still were defeated, and the reservoirs are today, right? And so just remembering historical things do show up in contemporary ways, right? And just knowing what does that look like. I want to give you a little bit of snapshot. So I was recently invited to go to Shenandoah University, and that's in Winchester, Virginia. And I really wasn't as acclimated with Winchester itself, but I had some understanding of Virginia. But one of the things I wanted to share with you, right, which is important for us as environmental folks, is that the way in which people engage with the land today has consequences, and what does colonialism look like in how we've developed these spaces. And I want to give you a little bit of a tidbit on why land acknowledgements, they're not supposed to be this past thing, right? So there's a bit of past, there's a bit of a historical context, but we have to remember that indigenous people are still occupying these spaces, right? And so colonialism is an ongoing process. And we need to build our mindfulness of how we engage in the present to impact the future. And one of the things that I love that some of our indigenous our folks have shared is thinking 7 generations beyond ourselves, right? So what are we really leaving in the future? And how often do we actually think that far beyond, right? We usually are only thinking about our current generation and maybe one generation removed, but often those conversations don't happen in that way, right? And even thinking about in some of the sustainability work that I've been doing right here with Susan Clark at the University of Buffalo, really thinking about how environmental justice must be incorporated into sustainability efforts, or else whatever you've developed is not sustainable because inequities are built within. But here's what I learned, right? I'm gonna give you a quick example. Right. So when I went to Winchester, Virginia, it was a beautiful historic town. And as I'd done a little bit more research, right, the Mesosomic and the Manahoac were the two tribal communities that had occupied in that space. And one of the beautiful things about tribal communities is that they can actually occupy the same land and even use it differently and negotiate what does that look like. The whole idea of one person or one tribe owning land was very foreign to them, right? So the Mesosomic, they are a federally recognized tribe in Virginia, and they were known for being skilled warriors. The Manahoac were last documented in the historical record in the 1700s, yet their ancestral mounds were present many, many years beyond that. And they were actually more recently in our lifespan kind of destroyed. And this destruction is an impact of colonialism, right? Destroying indigenous ancestral grounds, right? And so the way that the Manahoac actually constructed their burial grounds is they would create these large kind of like reservoirs, and they would add new soil as they laid people to rest, and they would become these large mounds that were really beautiful. And unfortunately, they were destroyed for construction purposes, right? And so I want to pull from this text, right? So it was described by John Alexander Williams, the author of West Virginia: A History for Beginners. And he states that the Native Americans in the Virginias, did not have a concept of private property. He puts that in quotes. In fact, to have the idea of an individual having exclusive use of a particular piece of land was completely strange to them, right? And thinking about how the Native Americans in Virginia practiced communal land ownership is something that we must learn from, and it is something we must leverage, and we have to do better, right? So that is an entire community owned the land upon which it lived. So other indigenous scholars have described how the notion of community expands beyond individuals, and it includes the natural earth, right? So it's unfortunate that our Western dominant cultural ways of doing science and social science and all these things compartmentalize these things, where indigenous folks say they're already in community, right? And so here we are trying to think about how to recreate the connections for things that are connected. We're just not always acknowledging it, right? So this is both beautiful and brilliant, and we must learn from our indigenous counterparts, right? So even thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement, right? And I want to acknowledge our social justice warriors and the sacrifices that they've made, right? Even thinking about the water crisis in Flint, Michigan, right? That's not a historical issue. They're still dealing with these things today, right? Even thinking about Katrina, right? These families were displaced. It doesn't mean they got to go home, right? And so thinking about that. So the objectives that I have for you today are three. One is, what is environmental justice? Two is to reflect on how environmental justice might inform your future work. And then three, what are guiding questions for practitioners? And I believe that's important, right? Because we all have a place and space in this work, right? And I think about it kind of like the Underground Railroad. What is your station? What is your locus of control? What are things that you can actually influence, right? And so thinking about that is so empowering. I want to start by also sharing this picture of myself next to my god sister. So she has on her red jacket and I have on my pink jacket, and we're holding up our earthworms. And this is in a housing project that we lived in Buffalo, New York, because I'm born and raised here. And at the time, I didn't have the language of environmental racism. I didn't have the language of environmental classism, right? But those factors shaped my lived experiences where the environmental conditions that I grew up in this housing project actually shaped my lived experiences where I loved nature. Although I had horrible allergies, right? I spent most of my childhood going to allergists and being given allergy shots. I spent most of my time having chronic issues with asthma, and especially during times like now, like COVID, you get reminded that you have pre-existing health issues, right? And so I literally thought that asthma was something that was genetic because people I knew had it. My god sister had it. People in my family had it. I didn't realize asthma was not genetic, but it was actually based on the environment and the context that we grew up in, right? And so, how that systemic environmental condition shaped my lived experiences, right, of growing up with these issues, and then still contending with them in adult years. And so environmental racism is nothing new. And I'll give you a little bit more context too, right? So a lot of my work is shaped by also critical race theory, right? And so critical race theory reminds us that racism is embedded and it is permanent within the fabric of our country. Here's the thing, that when people, the whole uproar about critical race theory, that's usually the tenet that people don't like, is that we say racism is permanent. What that also means is that it changes over time. So what it looks like today is not what it looked like 200 years ago, right? Is not what it looked like 300 years ago. And so these things change over time. So what it causes us to do is to figure out, what does it look like in our current context? And then the part of critical race theory that people don't get to is it's a commitment to social justice, right? What are we going to do about it now that we know? And so there's this action, right? So a lot of critical race theory are theorists are very, they have a lot of praxis to their work, right? And in thinking about this. So race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, or soil. The second most significant predictor, I'm sure you're going to guess, is class, right? And so, in thinking about that, how is it that demographic characteristics can identify where you're going to live, right? But if you do a little history on like redlining and what happened when cities became segregated and so on and so forth, you will see that all of these things were by design, right? I'm going to give you two website examples. So I'm going to stop sharing that PowerPoint. And as my daughter would say, don't mind my screen because my mom always keeps all these tabs open and she hates it. I'm going to share with you a couple different tools. The first one is a neighborhood at risk. And I love this tool. I love, love, love this tool. And so I'll make sure that you have access to the link. I just Google everything, unfortunately. I'm like, oh, that's it. And I'm going to take us to Buffalo. Right. And so some of us environmental folks, we're going to find ourselves in different cities and different places and spaces, and we're going to have to learn a whole new space. And you're going to be like, where do I start? Well, I don't know if you've experienced this, but here in Buffalo, we had temperatures in the high 90s, which is not normal for us, especially where we sit on the Great Lakes. And we know climate change is a real thing and it's happening, right? So we know that, and we felt it. We really, 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 really felt it this summer, where it was like extended days of these high temperatures. Now, here's the thing. If you're living in a space that has not historically experienced those temperature that increase in temperature, not everybody has central air. Not everyone has AC. And if they do, they might be running these things at higher rates than before. So that means if you're in a poorer community and the infrastructure isn't well, now you're going to be experiencing an increase in electrical outages, right? So I'm just going to pause and just show you a few things so that you can really mess around with this on your own time and in your own place. But the thing I love about the neighborhood at risk is it gives you two sets of data. You have the demographic data where you can say, I want to know which households are more likely to have no cars. What are housing units where there that are rentals, right? Where are the families living in poverty? But here's some of the beautiful stuff I also love in here. Areas lacking uh tree canopy. Why is that important? Well, you can do a strategic tree planting to say, it's going to be extremely hot in these spaces. We might want to make sure we're planting trees in every place that we can, right? And you can use tools like eye trees if you don't know which tree to plant. Eye trees can help you with that. Or areas of impervious surfaces, right? These things are important because if you have a lot of blacktop, that can also increase that temperature. So, like if you're saying, I just want to know what are the communities that are lacking tree canopy at least 93%. And I don't know if you can see this, but the table here will alter and it'll tell you this area, right? And they usually get down to the census tract, right? Which is really good. You could say how many families there live in poverty, and it says 97.1% of that area is lacking tree canopy. 62.9% is an area of an impervious surface, right? And so why are those things important? Because if we're thinking about the quality of life of these individuals, these are also areas of old infrastructure. And I'm going to show you another tool that I just love, EJ Screen. But before I move on, the part here that I love, 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 um, and when I say Headwater Economics, they did a phenomenal job with this tool. It is so user friendly. There isn't a big old webinar you have to watch in order to play around with it. You see what I'm doing here. If you look at the top, I mean, they have a how to use this tool. It says Buffalo is expected to experience a 301% increase in extremely hot days and a 13% increase in days with heavy participation within 25 years. Like, wow. But if you're like, I just want to know for the next 5 years, it'll tell you, right? So this isn't a hypothetical thing that is happening. These are the projections. And the beautiful thing about this is you can export this data and use it for your report. So like let's say you wanted to write a grant or sorry, you wanted to write a grant or you want to justify the need for a project or an area to focus on. You can cite these reports. And let's say you're like, you know what? Okay, this was on the higher admissions end. We've been doing some improvements. Let's just give us the lower projection of if admissions just so happens to be lower, right? And it will modify that and give you that data. And just one thing I want to show you again, one of the things I love, 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 you could download that report where you've either selected a track or you could download the whole city if you wanted that too, right? And you can select on the sides what are the factors that you want highlighted in your report, right? And so why does this work become important? Because then you can justify here are the areas in which environmental justice issues can be significant, right? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and change my screen now. Again, I always go to Google. My daughter makes fun of me. So I'm going to go to EJ Screen. If you have not played around with EJ Screen, you are not living your best mapping life. I love mapping tools that are simple. You don't have to be a GIS mapper to figure it out. But if you're like, I need some quick demographic environmental data, the last tool was one that's helpful. EJ Screen is again, this is put together by the EPA. So if you have not looked at their environmental justice resources, please take the time to look at what they have. They have a whole suite of where this data comes from, what is environmental justice, and you can just peruse there. I'm not going to spend that time right now. But what I'm going to do is open up and share this tool with you because I want to give you another look at buffalo, right? And so I'm going to go ahead and change my base. I always kind of go to this imagery hybrid because I just like for it to look kind of like the the city, right? So it look like an image. Well, it is an image. Anyways, so I'm going to zoom in and I'm going to go by zip code. And I know, as I'm from here, I'll go with 14215, and then I'll say Buffalo. So you could go by zip code. You could go by, this is Greider's a street. You could go by, if you wanted to put in the coordinates, it allows you to do that. It allows you to create a polygon. There, I say take your time, play around with this tool, and I'm going to show you Buffalo. Okay, so here is, this is on the east side of Buffalo, and I'm going to add to my map to just give you some visuals. So I just clicked on add to maps and I added the EJ maps. That's what you want. And there are three different types at the top. There's environmental indicators, there's demographic indicators, and there's EJ indexes. EJ indexes are the quick, dirty, to the point. Where are the environmental risks and where are the groups at risk? And it combines those numbers together. So I'm going to give you the demographics. It goes by populations of color, low income populations, linguistically isolated. So that could be, populations where you might have more, let's say, Latinx communities, or in our case, we have a high immigrant population on the west side of Buffalo. Less if you wanted to focus on education, if you had a initiative around children, kids under 5, and then where are people above 64, right? So you can add those layers to your map and you just click add map. But I'm going to go straight to the EJ indexes. And remember, I have asthma. So this particulate matter 2.5 is actually really important to me. I want to know, what does this look like and watch what happens. And I'm going to move my face out of the way so I can see what's going on. So here's the thing. I'm going to zoom out just a little bit. Buffalo is an old industrial segregated city. So what you see here is kind of like a line, right? So this is North Buffalo. Here's South Buffalo. Here's the east side of Buffalo where predominantly Black people live. Here's the west side of Buffalo where more of your Latinx and immigrant populations live. And South Buffalo is more has more poor white families, but there could be middle class mixed in there also, definitely. And then North Buffalo is more of your affluent white families. And I'm just going to show this on a map. If I just go by communities of color, and you could see that, right? You could see that. I'm going to go to EJ indexes really quick. So the beautiful thing about this tool is this. If you are like, where are my areas that are that I need to be concerned about, and I want to do some further investigation. You have, and this is the EPA telling you, like, you can export this map and use this as data. So if I say I want to know all the households that are in the 80th percentile or above, or 90th percentile or above, you could go ahead and say, wow, right here. And it'll tell you, oops, sorry. Mm-mm. It'll tell you, should have the I thought I had the census block, but it gives you the EJ index, the demographic index, and I thought it gave you the census block. I thought it gave you that, but maybe it does in the map, because this is also tracked onto census data. Also, there are other layers you can add. So if you wanted to know where the Superfund sites were, or schools. So let's say you wanted to target schools. Ooh, I don't know why my schools didn't pop on the map. Let's see. Let's try that again. Add layer, schools. I don't know why they're not popping on the map, but usually they're little green buildings, and it'll tell you what school it is. So let's say you wanted to target a school and it was at a high percentile, and let's say you even wanted to do strategic letter mailing to, like, let schools know, like, hey, you would actually probably be a really good candidate to plant some trees, right? And trees are natural filters, right? So not only are they going to help the air quality, they're going to provide oh, it's currently not available. Oh, that's weird. Okay. But you're able to save your sessions, you're able to, but here's the feature I really, really love. And it took me a while to figure this part out. You can export, you can name it. So I can just say sample. Uh-oh. Okay, you told me that. Thank you. You could save it. And then I could go ahead and export my map. Nope, I don't need that. And you see it's working. And so those could be the things that you plop right into your reports. You could zoom in. Whatever is on your screen is going to be the thing that is captured in that map. All right, but I'm going to go ahead and close this out and jump back into the presentation. Okay, so I'm going to go into a little bit of what is environmental justice as a framework. So the first part is, and this really comes out of the work of Robert Bullard, and I'll talk about him in a little bit more. He is out of so environmental justice comes out of the civil rights movement, right? And so when Martin Luther King was there on behalf of the sanitation workers in Memphis, that is part of the environmental justice movement. So the civil rights movement was so complex. So there are three main things about the environmental justice framework. Is one, all individuals have the right to live in healthy environments and be protected from environmental degradation. There is a causal relationship between pollution and increased health risks, which disproportionately impacts communities of color. And his later work, he starts to talk about poor white communities also. So we have to be mindful of that. There is a strong connection between race and class is also very important to look at, right? There should be equitable distribution of waste and shifting the burden to companies and not communities. Communities of color to have equal representation in the construction of environmental laws and policies. And in a paper that I did with Susan Clark, where we did a systemic lit review, and we looked at, what's going on basically within the sustainability literature and making connections to environmental justice. And what we saw is that even though people knew that minoritized communities should have access to making some of the decisions within what was going on, or having a seat at the table, and being able to have a voice, that always didn't happen. And actually that happened less that happened less than it should have, right? So these are things that we need to increase. Community-based approaches to decision making and holding governments and companies accountable, right? And so we still struggle with this, right? So the EPA, right now we have a whole environmental justice strand. New York State has an environmental justice department, but these things are still relatively new as it relates to environmental justice issues. And sometimes they don't have the funding to actually do the remediations that are always needed, right? And so here's just a picture of Robert Bullard. He's considered the father of the environmental justice movement. He has over 19 books. He's actually a sociologist. His wife was the one who was the environmental lawyer. I forgot where she was, but he talks about how it was somewhere down south. I can't remember now; it escapes me. But he was basically revealing what was going on in his wife's environmental justice cases, and that's where he came up with this concept. And he started to do more research, and I definitely tell you to read just one of his books. They're just phenomenal. Also, there's a really good TED Talk. It's very engaging, from Van Jones, and he talks about environmental justice, and he brings it back to plastics. And so I would say watch that clip. It is so engaging, and I've used it with students and adults in various spaces, and we just have really rich discussion about what is our responsibility um, to others, right? So how are we thinking about others, especially those that are marginalized? Now, the 16 principles of environmental justice, sorry, 16, 17 principles of environmental justice. Now, this is a pretty big deal. And again, I'm going to share these slides so you don't have to be running around trying to catch these links and things like that. But what happened in 1991? So this was Robert Bullard's work. This is out of his work. He led pulling together and having the first national people of color environmental leadership summit, right? And so basically all these folks came together, a whole grassroots movement, and they said these are these are the principles by which we believe environmental justice should be. These are the things that we need to focus. And I'm going to try to stop sharing my screen again and see if this hyperlink will let me open it. And it's a one pager, but it's so deep. And I think it's essential for us to all just take a look at it. Now, there may be portions that need to be revised to your context. There may be portions that aren't as you know where I'm going with that. So it has a whole declaration, right? You know, we the people of color, and it goes on, right? Environmental justice, right, affirms the scarceness of Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, and the right to be free from ecological destruction, right? And you could just go down, and it's so beautiful, right? Go down and spend some time and just read these 17 declarations that came out of this conference, right? And so as practitioners, that's one of the things that we need to do is, are we going back and looking at what our minoritized individuals advocating for? Like, are we listening to what they say they need, or are we telling them what they need? So one of the things I'm going to share with you about the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. So that's our DEC. And they came up with, they have their own environmental justice strand. So you probably have a local office. You definitely have the EPA. Use those federal resources, but you probably have state tools and offices as well. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of a tidbit of what that kind of looks like here in New York State. So they've identified, and the language is different. So they don't say, they say environmental justice communities, and they describe them as having a high potential of being environmentally justice oriented. But when you look at who have they defined, it is at least 51% of the population in an urban area report themselves as being of a minority group, right? So of color typically, or at least 33% of the population in a rural area reported themselves being of a minority group. So basically of color, or at least 23.59% of an urban or a rural household income is below the poverty level. Again, people of color and people in poverty, right? So these are things that check it. Do you have a local standard of where you've identified who are communities at risk? And then asking yourself, do you think you live an environmental justice community, right? And so I didn't have that language at the time as a child. I didn't know I was experiencing environmental racism, right? And so these are things that I've learned and evolved over time, right? And so some sample guiding questions, right? And definitely take them, tweak them, add to them. But here are some sample guiding questions that hopefully help you in your journey of connecting Mother Earth to people that occupy that space, right? Is, what issues, problems, or phenomena do I want to explore? That's important because typically where your interest and passion lies, one thing we've learned about uh, systems of oppression, you don't have to look far to find an issue that you can tackle there, right? So what are you interested in? Then thinking about, what do I already know about the community and the environment, right? What do I know? What resources or knowledge do I have on this topic? And then what do I need to learn more about? What environmental challenges do the local community does the local community face? Sorry for that typo. What inequities, if any, am I aware of? So here's the thing: a lot of times inequities are normalized, so we may not recognize them, right? So That's why that word aware is so important. We may not be aware of them because we've normalized them. That's why being in conversation with minoritized people is so important. And then how can this issue be connected to a topic in sustainability and environmental justice? Okay, there you go. And then what type of action can I take to participate in solutions to the issue, challenge, and or impacts? What are ways I can track my growth and success? So those last two questions are really important because so often we can identify an issue and something we want to learn more about, and then we don't become solution oriented. Don't just focus on the issues. You have to have a way that you can engage in action, or else this work becomes so hopeless. And there's always hope. We've seen change time and time and time again. So find ways to be solution oriented and work in community. And then what are ways I could track my own growth and success? That's important because what I know today is not the same as it was 15 years ago. And so it's important to track and acknowledge your own growth and where you are, and forgive yourself for what you may not have known at the time, right? So give yourself some grace in this work. And then lastly, maintain a critical critique about environmental policies and practices. Figure out what is your area of interest that you want to grow. One thing about social inequities, they're everywhere. Every system has them, right? But there's going to be an area that you're more interested in than others. Develop strategies for creating that growth track in your area of interest. That is so important. Does that mean, I can't show up for police reform? No, it doesn't mean that. It just means I'm not as knowledgeable. So I have to show up in ways that people tell me. Be a part of the community, right? And now it's so much easier to see what's going on through Facebook and different web events, or following them on YouTube. And so go to community meetings, show up, just sit around and be a part of the conversation. I've learned so much by doing that. Value input and insights from diverse audiences. That's so important, right? And then here's the biggest thing. It only takes 10% to cause a cultural shift, right? So find your people, right? So, and I think so often we think we have to get everybody on board, or we think about that person that is so far distant from us in our thinking, and we're like, well, how can we convince them? Don't waste your time on them. Focus on others that are interested in what you're doing and gain that positive momentum. And I've seen cultures and institutions and communities change time and time again. And so I just want to leave you with the movement is yours. Again, my name is Monica Miles. And that's a typo in my email. It's actually MMILES at paeaonline.org. And then there's my number if you need me. Thank you so much for your time today. I was truly honored and appreciate being a part of this series.